Welcome to DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
It's your boy Andy, and welcome back to the DeFi Slate YouTube channel. Smash the like button on this video, that really helps us out, and sit back and enjoy the content. Thank you very much.
What is going on, DeFi Slate fam? Welcome back to the DeFi Slate YouTube channel. We are here today with the co-founder of Eclipse. We're going to talk all about modular rollups and how they are really bringing kind of this next era of blockchain applications. So I'm super excited to talk to Neel Somani, founder of Eclipse. There's tons of building, tons of innovation happening all around the ecosystem, and Eclipse is really a trailblazer in the space of modular rollups and scalability. So I'm happy to introduce Neel. I'll pass it over to you and let you get started and kind of tell us what you're building over at Eclipse.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Rob. So I'm Neel, founder of Eclipse. Started Eclipse back in June. I had some previous experience over in the Terra ecosystem, Terra depegged, and I spent some time thinking about what the future of blockchains would look like. I was in Chicago, so I was talking with the Solana core folks. I was chatting with the Celestia team, and basically came to the conclusion that the only path to scaling crypto is via rollups. Because right now, every time we want to scale, we have to spin up another layer one blockchain, which basically means that this blockchain has to re-secure itself, has to get more computers on that network if it's proof of work. It has to stake value if it's proof of stake. But either way, there's only so much security to go around. Whereas for rollups, you get to all share this very decentralized base layer, and you all benefit from that same security. So that's the conclusion we came to. Ultimately, built Eclipse, we're offering customizable modular rollups, starting with the Solana VM as the execution layer. We'll allow for other execution layers in the future, so you can customize that part, and you can customize the base layer. So you could choose to deploy this to Ethereum, for example, or Solana. We're starting with Celestia. You can use Polygon Avail, and we took grants or funding from many of these ecosystems. So I was building an EVM on Terra. So that's a way to run Ethereum code on the Terra blockchain. And the thinking at that time was that I saw the success of Aurora on Near. Binance Smart Chain to some degree succeeded because it was EVM compatible. So we basically wanted to bring the same thing to Terra. And when Terra collapsed, I realized that my project basically lived or died by Terra's hand. And when Terra was no longer at the same level that it used to be, then it really made no sense to continue building the EVM. So I wanted to build something that basically solved that concern for developers. And now we're starting to see in the Solana ecosystem too, unfortunately, where a lot of projects feel like they want to move off of the Solana L1 and they really have nowhere to go. Question. And also I want to take a step back and talk a bit about execution layers versus consensus. So for a given blockchain, the execution layer, when we refer to it, it's usually the part that actually runs the code. But then there's also the part that provides security for the blockchain. So in a proof of stake network, everyone has to vote on the blocks, for example. So that's something that that you can kind of decouple. And typically these monolithic blockchains have not decoupled them historically. But in the future with the rollups, you can actually separate out that execution layer. And the Solana VM is really fast, highly parallelized. There's great tooling for it, such as Helios. There's Seahorse Lang, which lets you write Python programs for Solana. So all that, and this tooling continues to develop. I think people want to preserve that execution layer because they like it so much, but they just don't want to necessarily be on Solana consensus. So that I just wanted to start with that. And the second part is how do we provide all these different base layers? Because if you look at Optimism or Arbitrum, these rollups basically only exist on Ethereum. If you deploy to Optimism, you're stuck on Ethereum, and that's because they do this part called settlement on the Ethereum L1. And the settlement process basically determines, let's say you run a bunch of transactions in the rollup, and then you put the result on Ethereum. Settlement is a process of determining whether you ran those transactions correctly. Because the Ethereum has no visibility on that. A rollup is executing transactions somewhere else, and then it posts the result only. And in the case of a zero-knowledge rollup, it provides zero-knowledge proof, and optimistic rollups have their own methodology. But that's the key part that ties these Ethereum rollups to the Ethereum blockchain. So for us, in order to let you deploy your rollup to any chain, we can't do settlement on the L1. And instead, we have to provide our own settlement layer, which does that sort of process with our own methodology. And it just uses the layer one to store data. So now if you want to move to another blockchain, you just start storing that data on a different blockchain instead.
Awesome. Yeah, the data availability obviously comes from the data that is stored on these independent blockchains, and the execution occurs on these independent blockchains on the actual app chains, and the settlement all rolls up onto the settlement layer of Eclipse, which draws from this data that's available from all these other blockchains and is available to the Eclipse settlement layer through Celestia. And I think Celestia was in the news quite a bit when they were first kind of breaking ground on their data availability concepts. Can you talk about how Eclipse incorporates Celestia to bring data from these blockchains onto Eclipse, the settlement layer?
Yeah, it's really cool. So Celestia is largely the inspiration for Eclipse, and that's why we're starting with Celestia as the first base layer, because it's basically built for modular rollups like this. So the way that we interact with Celestia is, as you described, the execution layer, so the app chain, generates some block of data, and it stores it on Celestia. And from there, anyone can pull that block of data and also get a datability proof. So you don't even have to read the full block, but you can get some sort of assurance that the block is actually being properly stored. And you can use Celestia in other ways too, such as for a DeFi protocol on Eclipse, you can store large Oracle data on Celestia, and you can reference that within your rollup. And typically it's prohibitively expensive for an actual layer one to do, because if you want to store, let's say, commodities tick data, every few seconds the power price is updating. That would be, it's usually every really few minutes, but the power price is updating. That's a lot of data that you have to store online or on chain. But this way you can just store it in some chain that's basically specialized for storing that amount of data.
Yeah, and that may refresh every few minutes, but when you start to take into account commodities data, stock data, bonds, all of this data that
foreign exchange, maybe currencies,
exactly, all of that adds up, and the different sections and categories of this data grows exponentially. That it's like you said, prohibited to store that much amount of data on one chain, because it's such a massive amount of data that now Celestia brings the data availability to layers like Eclipse, which is super cool. I mean, that unveils like just this new era of blockchain applications that wasn't possible before these levels of scalability. Is there blockchain applications or a certain industry that you see is particularly unlocked as a result of this new new echelon of data availability?
I think consumer apps is going to be the most interesting in this next wave, especially gaming, given if you had a fully on-chain game doing thousands or even millions of transactions per second, the only way to really scale that is through a rollup and storing all that data off-chain in some sort of data availability layer. Like I think that, OPCraft, Optimism made a version of Minecraft running fully on-chain, which is awesome. And that amount of data would not have been possible to store until we had these data availability layers. So that's one avenue. Another is more like TradFi type applications in DeFi. I think right now we have a lot of crypto native DeFi applications, but a wider variety of oracles to bring that kind of data that we were describing, such as commodities data or foreign exchange tick data, things like that, I think is going to be really interesting too. And then the last category is just traditional consumer. And I don't want it to be as simple as just Twitter on chain, because that's not really a crypto native idea. And you'd have to break the network effects of Twitter. But just an entirely new blue ocean type of idea that uses crypto in a novel way. And I can't say off the cuff what that might be, but I want people to start thinking about these very social applications and things that almost like a Web 2 type of application, but now you can finally run it on chain.
Yeah, and that brings together kind of like the best pieces of the internet so far, is the scalability of something like Web 2 that has allowed social networking and applications to run. With the transmission of money as a piece of information, now we can transmit value over the blockchain as easy as we can submit like a text or a WhatsApp or something over the internet. It's just as easy to submit value, which is super cool when we start to kind of let our imaginations wander to the types of applications that could be built. I'm sure there's stuff that we haven't even thought about that is probably in position to take the world by storm once these applications start to become more clear.
It's like the invention of JavaScript for the internet. JavaScript enabled so many new types of interactive applications. And if people thought in terms of Web 1 or something, and they just made static pages with maybe just a JavaScript dongle, then we wouldn't have seen the types of fully interactive applications such as like Facebook. As you're scrolling, it's just constantly updating the feed, and it's a seamless user experience that's just totally different than anything that existed before.
Yeah, and another piece that Eclipse adds to the equation is blockchain composability. If I'm not mistaken, you have data availability from each blockchain that's rolling up through Celestia into Eclipse. Does that bring Ethereum on-chain data together with Solana and Cosmos and these other blockchains so that Eclipse is this one house of data that's on-chain and all these other independent blockchains?
So each execution chain gets to pick one data availability layer. So like a chain might pick Celestia, or they might pick Ethereum or something, and they can communicate to each other through our settlement layer. So it is like a little bit more interoperable. And to be fair, Celestia doesn't really have smart contracts to begin with, so it doesn't really make sense to like there would never be like a bridge that just like directly connects to Celestia. but yeah, that's like basically one advantage, which is that now but Eclipse basically acts as a bridge in that case. Like our settlement layer, it provides bridging, and it also provides that sort of functionality that I was getting at before, which is ensuring that the execution was done correctly. So that like the settlement layer has two functions.
Got it. Okay. The settlement layer has bridging as one function. I think that's a pretty well understood concept. And what was the other?
And the second function is like, let's say the execution layer produces a block of data and stores it on Celestia. Celestia doesn't actually verify that block of data was executed correctly. So that's what the settlement layer basically does. You'll ask it, hey, how much money do I have? And the settlement layer will say, according to the set of valid rules, we looked at the blocks on chain. This one's not valid, so we ignored it. This one is like produced by the wrong person, so we ignored it. And finally, it'll come to like it'll apply those state transition rules until it gets to what is the correct state.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's almost like a verified or validator in a certain sense of the data that's executed on certain blockchains.
Yeah, for an optimistic rollup, yeah, it's like it's a verifier. That's exactly what it's called.
Cool. So the optimistic rollup that you mentioned, I think that really touches on some of the styles and frameworks that existing rollups are moving forward with. And obviously optimism, right, is the optimistic rollup that everyone kind of knows and loves. And we have ZK rollups and other types of rollups as well. How does Eclipse take the work that these existing rollups have done and kind of bring it to the next level?
Yeah, so we take the results from Arbitrum and we apply that same bisection method to the Solana virtual machine. The trickiness with Solana, so let's say you want to, let's say you disagree with someone, you're like, hey, that guy executed that incorrectly, and now I need to prove on chain that, or I need to prove in some way that they executed it wrong. You basically need two things. One is that you have to verify that the inputs are all agreed on. So you have to say, okay, these are what the accounts looked like beforehand. And then the second part is you need to actually verify that when you apply the state transition, that the result is different than what that person said. So on that first part, that's the tricky part for Solana, because in Ethereum, there's an actual like Merkle tree that represents the state. And you can say, hey, this part of the state, like I can give like a proof, I can give a series of hashes that basically implies, yeah, this is like the starting state for this account. Here's like the starting state for another account. Whereas there's no way to do that for Solana. So we actually have to change the way that the data is stored in the Solana VM in order to facilitate that.
Very cool. Very cool. And is that a result of Solana's consensus mechanism?
It's actually like it's a totally separate. So Solana has a bunch of different optimizations they made. One is like with consensus, they have this like proof of history thing. They have C level, which is the parallelization. This is referring to their memory model. I think it's called Cloud Break.
Okay, their memory model. Got it. So that's almost how the transactions are verified. The parallel in the Ethereum world is a Merkle tree for validating those inputs, and there's not really
yeah, it's not a Merkle tree for Solana. Exactly. Yeah, it's just like every account is stored. They do have caches for those accounts, but the state root isn't really like, it's not like a Merkle tree root.
Got it. Okay. Now, just kind of like taking a step back, I have questions kind of all across the map. I'm not a computer scientist by trade. I'm kind of curious actually what like your personal background is, kind of how you got into crypto. Before we kind of trace that history, the question that comes to mind is kind of one of stateless machines, because it sounds like now Solana is, how these blockchains trace the root of the state is a little bit different. So I'm curious, kind of like in terms of the most modular implementation for these blockchains that is going to end up being the composable, interoperable one. How does this relate to kind of the concept of a stateless machine that's super modular? And kind of from there, I'm curious on your history in crypto and kind of how you got started.
Yeah, Joel. So I guess like two totally separate questions. I'll answer the first part in terms of like our opinion, which is that, so for all these different execution layers like Solana, or if you look at Aptos and Sui, they have Move, Ethereum has the EVM, you could just factor out the virtual machine altogether. And there's actually this library in Rust called Solana_RBPF, RBPF, Rust BPF, Rust Berkeley packet filter. That's the name of the Solana. That's like the official, like nerdy name of the Solana virtual machine. It's a Berkeley packet filter with some extensions. So like these virtual machines could be factored out altogether, and all these other optimizations that people are making should basically be thought of as separate. In the case of like the memory model, for example, if you need to re-implement the memory model in some other way, you can actually preserve the virtual machine in almost its entirety and just like implement that as a separate module within the execution layer. And totally separate from that would be thinking about how you implement consensus. And like Solana has its own like optimizations to its consensus protocol. Cosmos uses Tendermint. So we want people to be able to mix and match these parts. And as far as just like separating execution from consensus, that's something that Cosmos really pioneered through ABCI. You can specify like an ABCI client implementation. And that's how we got Evmos, for example. They implemented the Ethereum virtual machine as like the ABCI client. And then you can swap in whatever consensus you want, which is typically Tendermint, but theoretically it could work with other consensuses too. So that's in terms of like how we think that blockchain should be built in terms of these like modules, and even within the execution layer itself, you could sort of mix and match pieces, such as for Solana, there's no mempool, whereas we want people to be able to introduce a mempool if they want to, and there's some reasons why you'd want to do that, because say you want to do like an MEV auction, so you want people to be able to capture arbitrage opportunities and return that to their own protocol. That's something that typically requires a mempool, and we're working with Skip protocol in order to implement that. So that's like the first question. Second question on my background. So I'm an engineer by training. I did for undergrad, I did CS, math, and business at Berkeley. I was a software engineer over at Airbnb, and then I joined Citadel, where I worked as a quant in the commodities group, and I did power, gas, things like that. Which is why I was like thinking when I mentioned when I claimed power was recalculated every couple seconds, I was like, that's just like not true, because I used to like do all kinds of stuff with power. And then after that, I left in March of this year. Was briefly building in Terra, as I mentioned. That DePag started this thing, and my foray into crypto was I bought crypto like several years ago. I saw it go up, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Then I was like, oh, this is all fake. This is a scam. And then my friends started sending me white papers, because a lot of them entered crypto professionally. And then I got interested again, and I was like, oh, this is actually a really interesting space where a lot of cutting edge problems are being solved. And then I was motivated to actually enter it.
Very cool. So engineer by trade. We have a lot of guests on the podcast who are kind of entrepreneurial in spirit, and they've worked maybe for some other projects and have gone through a few startups to ultimately get to the place where they've settled in crypto as a startup or otherwise. And it sounds like this is kind of your first startup business. How's it going? Like what do you like? What's changed in your mind from kind of like the 9-to-5 lifestyle at Airbnb and Citadel to like, full on crypto degen?
Yeah, I mean, totally different types of roles. Like over at Airbnb, that's like the cushiest job you can imagine. Airbnb, when I joined, it was like as big as Google, or not as big as Google, but it's like that kind of lifestyle. It's like you show up, people show up kind of late-ish, you kind of leave whenever. It was largely remote right during COVID. So it was a very relaxed lifestyle. Citadel was more intense, where we actually still went into the office even throughout COVID. Just did like COVID tests and things like that. And I actually kind of liked that, because it's like a work hard, play hard lifestyle. I think that matches my energy, where I like to work long hours, but I also like to have a really good time, which I think people in finance really understand. And I also feel like people in crypto understand that too. So that's why I feel like this industry is like naturally just consistent with my personality. And then on entrepreneurship, I think the big difference was just the level of ownership you get. You're like very invested in every aspect of the project, because if you don't do it, like no one will. Whereas in Citadel, it's like maybe you're working on a desk or something, and yeah, like you're more responsible for like some bug or something like that. But it's not like there's no existential risk. Like Citadel's not going to die just because like one PM doesn't do like doesn't perform that well. Whereas your startup literally will. Like if you don't actually like hit the ground running and make sure you're constantly pushing on every front, then some other guy's going to eat your lunch. So and then there will be no company anymore. So that's kind of, and I kind of like that. It like puts a flame under you. It's like a chronic state of anxiety. But I also think that like I'm a strong proponent of crypto, believe in the market for the long run. So I'm excited about it.
Very cool. Awesome. So how's the company going so far? How is Eclipse like? What's the state of things at this point in terms of maybe the development cycle of the product? And, do you guys have some traction that you're starting to, see some projects look to deploy with Eclipse?
Yeah, we'll probably answer it the other way around. So yeah, we have like 50 to 100 projects. I think it's something like 70 or 80 right now that are going to be deploying to Eclipse. The low hanging fruit is projects.
Are most of those already deployed on other blockchains?
Yeah, so a lot of them are. Some of them are very early, and they're picking Eclipse because it's just the only implementation that makes sense given what they're building. So, for example, if they require like just crazy amounts of throughput, maybe they have some special sequencer requirements. So they need the actual execution layer to do something special. Then Eclipse is the best solution for them. So that's most of the projects though are just coming from Solana. So that's one avenue, but I feel like that's one kind of that's not really a huge priority for us. We also like are pretty friendly with Solana. We pass a lot of projects back to the Solana L1 because we're like, this is just not a good fit for our architecture. And it makes more sense to be on the L1. But the kinds of projects that I think are really interesting are other like networks such as layer ones or maybe projects that want to somehow offer Solana VM compatibility. So that's like the Injectives of the world. Folks like that, right now they offer a WebAssembly VM. Now they could offer a Solana VM as well. So that's really interesting to me. And a second is like the enterprise use cases, like Disney Chain or like Spotify Chain, something like that, where you could stream continuously. And we brought on head of BD recently, has more of an institutional background. And those are the kinds of partnerships that we're really interested in, given that those kinds of applications don't really make sense on other chains. Given they want to like a lot of the time these Web2 scale applications have niche requirements that can't be supported by an ordinary layer one. But because we can develop that bespoke infrastructure for Eclipse at the execution layer, it actually makes, and they also don't have to worry about security because normally you'd have to spin up your own layer one, you have to secure the network, and you have to also maintain the liveness, which is something that Disney's not going to do. Whereas if they could just spin up their Rollup and borrow the security from Ethereum or something, now it's much more feasible. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, they can borrow that security as well as some other modules that come as a part of the Ethereum blockchain, and then kind of customize from there, as you have done to the Solana VM. And this is kind of just a question about like your path to where you are now, going through the Solana and the Cosmos ecosystem. You've clearly seen plenty of turmoil, right? Solana has had its difficulties. Cosmos has had its. Were there projects maybe that came along that were very enthused to deploy on Eclipse, and then they had to kind of backtrack based on kind of like the events that happened on the respective chains? My question is rooted for anyone who's listening who is a developer and looking to deploy some application on a relatively scalable chain. What's the process like? Do you guys what's the process for someone who's looking to deploy on a chain and is maybe already deployed or looking to deploy on one of these other chains? How does that process differ when they deploy to Eclipse?
Yeah, so one of the biggest early pioneers for Eclipse was Zebic. Zebic is a streaming payments protocol. They're onboarding hundreds of thousands of users onto Zebic. And you can imagine if all these users are sending it's a streaming payments platform. So if you get paid like $2,000 a month or something, now it's streamed continuously throughout the month instead. If you had like hundreds of thousands of users, that's hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. With the way that Zebic's architecture, streaming architectures don't always require that. and like on like Superfluid, for example. These other architectures don't, but Zapic is architectured that way. So as a result, they wanted something like Eclipse. And over the last like couple of months, we basically, I mean, even before all this stuff happened with Solana, we were basically targeting this use case where if people wanted to move off theoretically, then they had that option. It's a go-to-market tactic. It's not really the long tail as I was mentioning, but yeah, that's why like over the last couple of weeks, especially with all this FTX stuff, we've seen this huge inbound and an influx of projects that are coming over. And the reason why it makes a lot of sense for a Solana project is because there's a minimal lift. They've already written their code for Solana. All they have to do is point the CLI to the Eclipse network and deploy it like usual. So for some projects, we've given them early access to our private testnet, but we're launching public testnets in Q1 of next year.
Awesome. Very cool. So that gives me a sense, and all of our listeners a sense of like the path to mainnet, essentially, where, like you said, public testnet Q1 of next year. Our community can get involved by reaching out, I believe, on Twitter, Discord, and kind of like understanding the Eclipse architecture, and then from there start to experiment on testnet. And there's tons of benefits of deploying on something like Eclipse. You mentioned some of these apps that are really high throughput and have many transactions per user. As they scale up in users, then that's going to exponentially scale the amount of transactions that is flowing through that chain. We saw kind of like some numbers that came out on daily active users in the metaverse, right? And it was surprisingly low. That, I expect that to shift just as crypto becomes more user friendly and the user experience improves. What's your take on kind of like the low, like daily active users that we've seen in some of these specialized environments, and how do you think that trend continues into the future?
Yeah, I think the issue right now is a lot of the people are in crypto because they're trying to capture some kind of yield opportunity. But the issue is that yield needs to have a sustainable source. And that source needs to be people that just use crypto for fun, or there's some reason why they're using it. So there's some consumer application that they enjoy using, and that's what they're willing to pay for. And the yield is always downstream of that. So I think that's like the main reason why there are so few users. One is that the infrastructure just isn't there yet. And we need infrastructure that can support those consumer use cases. And the second is that the kinds of users that do exist are pretty much mercenary. And that's because and also just if you don't have a sustainable source of yield, that yield will go away. And when it goes away, then the users leave too, those users. But actual like true users that are enjoying the application and they get some sort of other benefit out of it will stay. So that's one shift that I think needs to happen. And then as far as like the advantages of an Eclipse type architecture, I think the biggest advantage is sovereignty. So they can always leave an ecosystem. They can swap out the L1. They can even swap out the execution layer in the future. We're going to offer a move execution layer. And then the second benefit is customizability. And like it's sort of a downstream effect is that, of course, you can customize it and choose a super fast execution layer and get all of that throughput. But you can also customize it to have slower block times. If you're an NFT project and you want to control a mint, maybe you want to introduce a mempool like we were talking about. You want to charge gas in your native token, or just have gasless transactions for governance. All sorts of customizations that I think would be prohibitively difficult to do every time you wanted to spin up a new layer one. But every time you're spinning up a new like Rollup, I think it's more feasible.
Got it. And that's the path that infrastructure seems to take, is almost an evolution of infrastructure into the consumer-facing apps, when those like layer 3, 4, or 5, whatever you want to call an app chain, starts as an infrastructure layer for its application and then evolves into its kind of siloed off execution environment. We kind of see like this path that a project takes from infrastructure to application and consumability once it kind of goes through that evolution.
Yeah, it's also interesting to see how like each of these infrastructures often has a flagship product. Like for example, Terra, even though we don't like to use this example, but Anchor Protocol, which offered 20% yield, I don't even know whether we want to call it a use case or what, but it was a quote unquote killer use case for a stablecoin. They're offering 20% yield for something that looks kind of like a bank account or something, like a savings account. If you look at Solana, there's like Serum is like a central limit order book that could have only existed on Solana, or like Magic Eden, for example. It's a NFT use case, and the fees are super low compared to Ethereum. So it makes sense to trade NFTs on Solana.
What are you excited about in crypto and blockchain aside from Eclipse?
Let me think. One really interesting thing is just zero knowledge tech outside of zero knowledge rollups. So generic zero knowledge tech, especially stuff that impacts social. So playing around with identity, maybe types of like communities or maybe types of labor, for example, where you can just reveal relevant traits about yourself and hide the rest. And maybe like ways you can destroy your identity altogether if needed. That stuff is interesting to me. Another area is like applying ML and like putting machine learning models on chain, with the reason being that a lot of ML models are censored. And if you look at like Twitter's recommendation engine, I personally think that like it's changed a little bit and like my feed's just been trashed lately. And maybe that's just, just a bad couple weeks or something. But it's also interesting to add transparency to machine learning models and actually add like allow people to customize things if they want to. So
Yeah.
that's another area that's interesting. And then the third one is like new DeFi primitives. Sorry, go ahead.
I was commenting on the ML on chain, and open source ML could certainly level up quicker than it is now. I didn't mean to interrupt. So you were starting to talk about some DeFi primitives as well. I can definitely see that when we start to build composability and interoperability across blockchains, some new DeFi primitives popping up.
Yeah, totally. Like infrastructure hedging, I think is an interesting idea because there's so much infrastructure risk, especially in bridges. These bridges get hacked. And if you could pay some regular insurance, and then if a bridge gets hacked, you get a huge payout, and that compensates you for whatever money you lost. Sorts of like DeFi primitives like that. I think things like zero slippage AMMs are like not interesting at all to me. Like I think there are these like old era of like quote unquote innovations that weren't really super innovative in my opinion, and I think we want to start seeing things they're like really like 0 to 1 thinking, almost in the same way like the first AMM ever, like or just like the Uniswaps of the world. Uniswap was like the first of its kind. That's a 0 to 1, and that's a new idea back then. But like there's no reason to be like doing these tiny little adaptations on that when we could build like the next Uniswap. You just have to look in a totally different area. So yeah. I think that'd be nice to see.
Very cool. Yeah. And with the new levels of scalability, those types of applications are going to look completely different, right? Where maybe it takes like a certain level of throughput, and then that application kind of reaches that height. Unlike Uniswap, which was kind of some novel concept on how
exactly it was because they were limited by throughput. That's why they made Uniswap. Like if fees are trivially low, then you can just make an order book.
Yeah, exactly. So now these applications are going to start to pop up where it'd be like, well, why didn't someone think about this before?
Right.
Yeah, and I can see someone popping up like a Twitter that doesn't really look like a Twitter, and some novel social networking application. And you mentioned tons of zero knowledge, applications as well outside of rollups. Kind of putting this, combination of applications onto infrastructure that has like new levels. I think we're in a really exciting time of crypto, and it's like not really. I mean, I hear from just like normies, crypto's dead, right? So this is really an exciting time, I think, in terms of innovation, because we can see what's at the base layer, and it's almost like we're like just scrapping away all the noise, and at the bottom is like a Uniswap, right? A 0 to 1.
I totally agree. We've thrown away all the crap, and the only stuff that's going to stick is stuff that actually works, and that's awesome.
Yeah. And when we have just like a few of those things in the room, it's like, okay, then we can really start to combine these things because there's not very much noise that occurs on each of these applications.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think also there's still some room to innovate on like more liquidity efficient bridges. I have a lot of thoughts. I wish that I prepared an answer for this question. If there was maybe next time I can hop on and we can talk about some ideas, because I have like lists of consumer ideas that I'd love to see, and maybe we can share some of those. I'd have to be more careful about. Maybe I might have already committed to someone building one of these ideas. I might have handed it off to someone, so I don't want to like steal their thunder. But yeah, one last area that I think is really cool is token incentivized physical infrastructure. Things like Helium, Pollen, seeing the decentralized battery networks, such as this project called React. They basically given my power background, I just like find this interesting. But in California, we have super cheap power prices during the day. And in the evening, it's very expensive because the sun goes down. You can't use solar. So you need batteries to take that power from the daytime and use it in the evening. But building big batteries is difficult. In like Moss Landing, for example, I think this is like earlier this year, maybe last year, like one of the batteries literally lit on fire. They had to like close down the plant for the week or something. So the way to solve that is that consumers can now just like plug batteries into their wall or something. You can decentralize the storage of this power, and it makes the grid more efficient.
Yeah, right. Because then we can kind of like power share depending on who's using the power and who wants to give it up for some extra yield. Yeah, there's so many applications, right? And it kind of seems like they're all kind of trending on chain for one reason or another, either to tie in the data availability that's already existent on the chain, or the security that exists on chain. What do you and we're kind of getting close on time. So in these last few minutes, what are you seeing in the blockchain space that has advantages over Web 2 and some more familiar but also prehistoric types of technology stacks?
Yeah, I think removing trusted third parties is the most important part. It's something that I think consumers tend to care less about, and it's not enough to break a network effect. But for example, I think that Teleport is really interesting. Teleport is Uber on chain. It's on Solana. And what's cool about Teleport is, one, they've removed the intermediary of Uber, which is, you can make an argument against it, which is that the main cost and overhead that Uber has is primarily regulatory. And it's like marketing, like expanding in these new regions. And decentralizing the network doesn't really solve that. But the upsides of Teleport are that I actually think that the Uber price is incorrect. And I don't really get where the money's going, because for me, I see a really expensive price. The driver says they're being paid almost nothing, and Uber says they're not profitable. So like that doesn't really seem to make sense. But of course, like they could just be pouring it into like regulatory and marketing and things like that. But yeah, I think like removing that and having a more transparent pricing mechanism, and you could even do like maybe I like can provide a more efficient price as a trader. Like for example, there are times when I can book a ride in an hour. I'm like, this is a steal because I know it's going to rain in an hour. I want to be able to go like long 1,000 Ubers in 1 hour and then dump it like in an hour from now when the rain starts. And that can also help like make the market more efficient.
Yeah, Teleport derivatives. Did you go to their party in Miami?
I unfortunately flew out on Saturday afternoon because I thought that Art Basel was a conference, and it turns out Art Basel is just a big party, and it was fun, but I think it was a little much for me after a couple of days.
Yeah, Miami will age you 100x the actual.
Well, I'm still recovering. It's been like a week. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah, they had a super fun party, and we took a Teleport there, and it was super easy. They were doing kind of their incentive program, so it was only $1 to actually take it, and they offered to pay in USDC or some other payment options, and they obfuscate all of the mechanics behind a user interface that looks very similar to Uber, and as you described, all of those payments go directly to drivers without an intermediary like Uber that is spending it on regulatory or marketing or
Yeah. What's awesome is I was over in Lisbon for a Breakpoint, and they also had this like teleport incentive program. It was a free teleport, but I got in this and I just like asked the driver, so like what other platforms do you drive on? It was like Uber or Lyft. She's like, I only drive for teleport, which is crazy to me. It means they're actually breaking into new markets. And some of these people aren't even really familiar with Uber and Lyft. Teleport's their first entry into ride sharing, in the same way that Web3 was often people's first entryway into like trading or finance in general.
Yeah, very much so. They're breaking ground, Teleport specifically, and Web3 companies in general that are removing intermediaries and ultimately constructing this more efficient system as value is transferred directly to the end user or the end consumer of that value, rather than some intermediary revenue, rent seeking and kind of profit cutting that kind of keeps that value for themselves and centralizes. Neel, is there anything else? I felt like we went, kind of 0 to 1 ourselves in this podcast. Is there anything that that you want to touch on for the community listening that we
I think
didn't
the
touch
big
on?
thing is just follow us on Twitter for updates. It's Eclipse FND on Twitter, and we're going to be launching our brand and website within the next couple of weeks. So there's going to be a lot of documentation on Eclipse. You can read through, get details on our architecture, and you can reach out with any questions.
Awesome. Cheers, Neel. This was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining.
Great, thank you.